Picture yourself in New Haven, Connecticut, 1962. You answered a newspaper ad. The pay is $4.50, which in today's terms is about $40. You're sitting across a table from a man in a grey lab coat. He explains that you'll be helping with a study on memory and learning. You'll play the role of the teacher. The other participant, a friendly middle-aged man named Wallace, will be the learner. Simple enough. Then they strap Wallace into a chair in the next room, attach electrodes to his wrist, and you sit down in front of a machine with a row of switches. The switches are labeled from 15 volts to 450 volts. At the far end, danger, severe shock. And beyond that, 2 switches labeled simply 30. You begin asking Wallace questions through the intercom. When he answers incorrectly, and he starts answering incorrectly quite often, you are told to press the next switch. You hear him grunt. Then at 150 volts he asks to be let out. You look at the man in the lab coat. He says calmly, "Please continue." You feel your stomach turn. You press the switch. Here is what Milgram actually found. You were not alone in pressing it. 65% of participants went all the way to 450 volts. But that number is not the point. The number is almost a distraction from the real finding, which is about what was happening inside the people who kept going. They weren't comfortable. They weren't indifferent. They were sweating. They were pleading with the experimenter to stop. They were doing something that looked from the outside like obedience, but from the inside it felt like the responsible thing to do. This is Night Voyager. Tonight we're looking at why good people follow instructions into harm and what that tells you about yourself. Stanley Milgram ran his obedience experiments at Yale University beginning in 1961. He was in part motivated by the Eichmann trial, the prosecution of Adolf Eichmann, the Nazi bureaucrat who had organized the deportation of millions of Jews and who famously appeared in court as a quiet, procedural, utterly ordinary man. Hannah Arendt covered the trial for The New Yorker and coined the phrase most people know, the banality of evil. What she meant was specific and often misquoted. She was not saying that evil is trivial. She was saying that some of history's most catastrophic harm was produced not by sadists or ideologues at the levers, but by administrators following procedure. Milgram wanted to test whether that dynamic was unique to Germany, to war, to authoritarian systems. His hypothesis was that it probably wasn't. He was right, and the result disturbed him for the rest of his life. He published his findings in the Journal of Abnormal and Social Psychology in 1963, and the paper generated immediate controversy. Many psychologists assumed the results reflected something culturally specific to his sample, or that the participants somehow knew the shocks weren't real. They didn't. Subsequent studies confirmed the core finding across decades and countries. The question was never really whether people obey. The question Milgram spent the next decade trying to answer was, what is actually happening inside them when they do? Before we get into the mechanism, let's be precise about what the experiment actually showed, and what it didn't, because the popular summary gets it badly wrong. The popular reading of Milgram goes like this: put ordinary people under authority, and they'll do anything. 65% will torture a stranger. Humans are secretly monstrous, and social order is the only thing keeping that monstrousness in check. This reading is factually incomplete and theoretically wrong. Milgram himself rejected it explicitly. Here is what the data actually showed. The participants were not indifferent to the harm. Observers documented visible, measurable distress in nearly every subject: trembling hands, nervous laughter, physical sweating, verbal protests to the experimenter. In one documented session, a participant suffered a full seizure from stress. They cared. The distress was real. What the experiment revealed was not that humans suppress their conscience under authority. It revealed that humans experience genuine moral conflict and resolve that conflict by deferring to the institutional framing of the situation. The conscience wasn't absent. It was present and overridden, not by fear, not by sadism, but by a competing moral logic. A logic that said, the experimenter knows better, the science matters, making a scene would be worse than complying. That is a completely different psychological finding, and it has completely different implications for how you understand your own behavior. Milgram spent the decade after 1963 developing a theoretical framework to explain his own results. He called it Agentic State Theory, and he published it fully in his 1974 book, Obedience to Authority. The theory proposes a specific psychological shift. In everyday life, you operate as an autonomous agent. You set your own goals, you judge your own actions against your own moral standards. You own the consequences of your choices. This is what Milgram called the autonomous state. But when you enter a hierarchical system, a workplace, a military unit, a laboratory, a religious institution, a courtroom, something changes, you reorient. You begin to see yourself not as an agent, but as a component. Your role is to execute the instructions of a legitimate authority. The moral weight of the outcome shifts upward to the person who gave the order. You are now in the agentic state. Milgram was very careful about one thing. This shift is not coercion. Nobody forces you into the agentic state. Nobody threatens you. You enter it voluntarily, because every functioning society requires it. The surgeon follows the hospital protocol. The soldier follows the chain of command. The employee follows the manager's brief. These are not pathological behaviors. They are the load-bearing structures of organized human life. The problem, the specific, dangerous problem, is that once you are inside the agentic state, your internal moral accounting system changes its reference point. You are no longer asking, is this right? You are asking, am I doing my part correctly? Here is where Erich Fromm enters, and where the theory gets psychologically deeper. Fromm was a German-American social psychologist who published Escape from Freedom in 1941. His central argument was this: human beings are uniquely burdened among animals by self-awareness and the weight of individual choice. Freedom is not simply desirable, it is also exhausting, anxiety-producing, and for many people, genuinely frightening. To be free is to be responsible for the consequences of your own moral decisions, with no one to defer to and no institutional backstop. Fromm argued that this weight is so heavy that many people actively seek to surrender their autonomy, not because they are forced to, but because doing so brings genuine psychological relief. He called this the authoritarian solution. The individual trades their freedom for the security of belonging to something larger and more certain than themselves. Now place that insight inside the Milgram lab. The participants weren't just complying with an authority. On some level, they were relieved to. The experimenter saying, "Please continue," wasn't just a command, it was an absolution. It removed the terrible burden of deciding individually whether this situation required them to be the person who disrupts it. Obedience in that room was not a failure of courage, it was the path of least psychological weight. This is the shift most retellings of Milgram never explain. Obedience didn't feel like obedience. It felt like the only sensible thing to do. Albert Bandura, the Stanford psychologist best known for the Bobo doll experiments, spent decades after Milgram developing what he called moral disengagement theory. Published in full in a landmark 1999 paper in Personality and Social Psychology Review, it maps 8 specific cognitive mechanisms that allow people to continue harmful behavior without experiencing the guilt they would otherwise feel. These aren't things people decide to do. They operate automatically, restructuring the moral landscape of a situation in real time. Let's name 4 of the most relevant ones from Milgram's data. First, moral justification, reframing a harmful action as serving a larger good. It's for science, the research matters. Second, euphemistic labeling, using sanitized language to avoid confronting what is actually happening. Participants were administering voltage, not hurting a man. The experimenter called it, "The experiment requires you to continue, not shock him again." Third, diffusion of responsibility. The harm becomes distributed across the system, so no single actor owns it. The experimenter is in charge here. I'm just following the protocol. Fourth, dehumanization. The victim becomes an abstraction. In Milgram's setup, the learner was in another room. His suffering was communicated only by voice, and then, in some conditions, by silence. Distance makes it easier. These mechanisms don't operate sequentially. They stack, they reinforce each other, and they run without conscious awareness. The person using them is not lying when they later say they didn't feel in control. The cognitive architecture had quietly shifted the terms of the moral situation while they were still inside it. Bandura's data on one of those mechanisms, dehumanization via distance, maps perfectly onto Milgram's own variant studies. Milgram didn't just run one version of the experiment, he ran 21 variations, systematically altering single conditions to measure what changed compliance rates. When the learner was in the same room as the teacher, visible, present, physically proximate, the compliance rate dropped to 40%. When the teacher was required to physically press the learner's hand onto the shock plate, it dropped to 30%. But when the learner was completely out of sight and out of earshot, no voice, no feedback at all, compliance climbed toward 90%. Distance doesn't just reduce empathy, it reduces the moral legibility of the situation. When you cannot see or hear the consequence of your action, your internal moral accounting system has no signal to process. The harm becomes theoretical, and theoretical harm is far easier to authorize than actual harm. This is why institutional harm is almost always mediated by layers of abstraction. The person who signs the form never meets the person the form affects. The committee that approves the policy never sits in the room where the policy is enforced. Distance is not a failure of empathy. Distance is engineered. It is a structural feature of systems that need human agents to perform actions those same agents would refuse at close range. The bar chart tells you something important. Compliance was not binary. It was a sliding scale, responsive to environmental conditions, which means it was never about character. It was always about architecture. Carl Jung would have found this unsurprising, though he would have described it in different terms. Jung's theory of the persona is relevant here in a way that almost no analysis of Milgram explores. The persona in Jungian psychology is the socially constructed identity a person presents to the world. The role face, the mask that corresponds to a specific social function. The doctor, the soldier, the employee, the study participant. The persona is not false, it is a real part of the self. But it is partial. It comes with its own rules, its own permitted behaviors, its own exemptions from the rules that apply in other contexts. Opposite the persona in Jung's framework sits the shadow, the unintegrated aspects of the self, including the moral instincts, the raw conscience, the parts of you that react with revulsion before thought kicks in. In Jung's model, the shadow doesn't disappear when you put on a persona. It goes off duty. The institution provides moral cover that temporarily exempts you from the shadow's demands. Inside the Yale laboratory, wearing the role of study participant, a specific set of behavioral rules applied. Rules that had nothing to do with the rules you operate by as a person who would never hurt a stranger. These were two different personas, with two different permission sets. Jung's insight is that this is not hypocrisy. It is how the psyche manages the competing demands of individual conscience and social membership. The problem is that institutional personas can be designed, deliberately or inadvertently, to provide cover for the shadow's outputs while labeling them as the persona's virtues. Compliance becomes diligence, silence becomes professionalism, harm becomes procedure. Philip Zimbardo, who in 1971 ran the Stanford prison experiment, a study so disturbing it was shut down after 6 days, spent the following 30 years developing what he called the Lucifer effect. His core argument aligned with Milgram's but pushed further. Situational forces, not personal character, are the primary determinant of harmful behavior in institutional contexts. He distinguished between dispositional explanations, those people are bad, and situational explanations. That situation produced bad behavior from ordinary people. His data, like Milgram's, pointed overwhelmingly to the situational, but Zimbardo added a dimension that Milgram's lab setup couldn't capture. The role itself rewrites the self-concept over time. Within days of assuming the role of guard in his mock prison, ordinary Stanford students began acting with genuine cruelty, not because they were ordered to, but because the role had begun to feel natural. The identity followed the role, not the other way round. The implication for Milgram's participants is significant. Most of them weren't just following an authority in that room, they were, moment by moment, becoming the kind of person who follows this kind of authority in this kind of room. Roles aren't costumes, they're rehearsals. Milgram, from Bandura, Zimbardo, Jung, each from a different angle, arriving at the same place. The capacity for institutional harm doesn't require extraordinary people, it requires ordinary situations designed just right. There is one more thing Milgram found that almost never gets mentioned in the popular version of the story. His 1963 paper documented that 65% of participants went to the maximum voltage. The follow-up studies examined what reduced that number. The most powerful single variable was not strength of character, prior ethical training, or even knowledge of psychology. It was peer dissent. In conditions where two other participants, who were actually confederates of the experiment, refused to continue and visibly walked away from the procedure before the subject had to make the same decision, compliance dropped from 65% to 10%. 10%. Not a reduction, a near elimination. One person dissenting from the authorities' framing of the situation, not a superior, not an outside expert, a peer, someone at the same social level, was sufficient to shatter the unanimity that the agentic state requires to function. This is the finding that changes the practical implications of everything Milgram showed. The agentic state is not inevitable. It is sustained by social unanimity. Break the unanimity, and the mechanism loses its grip. Here is where this stops being history and becomes personal. You have been in the Milgram lab, not with a shock machine, but the psychological structure has been identical. Think about the meeting where a decision was made that you knew somewhere in your body was wrong, not catastrophically wrong, not policy violation wrong, just quietly, clearly wrong by the values you would apply outside that room. And you said nothing. Not because you were threatened, not because you agreed, but because the room had a structure, and that structure had assigned moral authority upward, to the manager, to the committee, to the senior person, to whoever was holding the meeting agenda, and your internal calculus concluded that it was not your place to challenge it. That thought, "it's not my place," is the agentic state's signature phrase. That is precisely what Milgram's participants felt. Now think about the family dynamic where a pattern continues, one that everyone in the room is aware of, that everyone quietly knows causes harm, and it continues because disrupting it would require someone to claim more moral authority than the family has assigned them. Think about the online context where a pile-on is happening and you participate or stay silent because the social consensus in that space has defined participation as justice and dissent as complicity with the target. The lab coat changes its shape, but the mechanism is identical in every case. The institution frames the situation. The situation provides a moral grammar. The moral grammar makes complicity feel like responsibility, and your conscience, genuinely present and genuinely distressed, resolves the conflict by trusting the grammar. There are specific internal signals that indicate you have entered the agentic state. They're worth naming precisely, because they're easy to rationalize away in the moment. The first is the thought, "It's not my place." Full stop. Not "I disagree but I understand the constraints." Just the quiet sense that the moral authority here lives elsewhere, and that raising your voice would be claiming something you haven't been given the right to claim. The second is the retroactive justification, the story you build after the fact, not before. If you find yourself explaining your compliance to yourself after the meeting, after the conversation, after the post, you were not operating from your own moral framework in the moment. You were in someone else's. The third is what I'd call relief at delegation. The quiet sense of release when someone senior makes a call you are uncomfortable making. Not because the call was right, because the weight of deciding has been lifted. That relief is the psychic mechanism from identified. It feels like gratitude. It is actually abdication. And the fourth, perhaps the most telling, is the absence of a memory of choosing. Milgram's participants frequently described the experience afterward as if things had simply happened to them. They couldn't reconstruct a moment of decision. The agentic state doesn't feel like a choice. It feels like the situation unfolding naturally, which is precisely why it's so hard to interrupt from the inside. Which brings us back to Milgram's follow-up data, and the one finding that actually changes the calculus: peer descent. The participant who dropped the compliance rate from 65 to 10% wasn't a moral philosopher, wasn't someone with exceptional courage or unusual ethical training. They were simply a person at the same social level who said out loud, "I'm not comfortable continuing this," and then stopped. That action broke the social unanimity the agentic state requires. It gave the subject a reference point outside the institutional framing. It made visible that there was an alternative response available. Your own resistance to your agentic state is not primarily a solo act of will. Will is useful but fragile under institutional pressure. Milgram proved that. What works is the presence of a peer who has already broken the frame, which means your practical obligation is not just to notice when you are in the agentic state. It is to become the person who dissents first. For the person next to you who cannot yet find the words, their compliance may depend entirely on whether you speak before they lock in. That is the structural implication of Milgram's data, and it is in its way the only genuinely hopeful thing the experiment produced. The question Milgram's experiment leaves us with is not, are humans good or evil? That framing was always too simple. What the data shows is that human moral behavior is, to a disturbing degree, a function of social architecture, the design of the situation, the presence or absence of visible alternatives, the language used to frame the action being requested, the physical distance to the consequence, whether a peer has already said no. These are not fixed variables. They are designed by institutions, by social systems, by the people who set the terms of the rooms you walk into. Milgram didn't discover that people are capable of evil. He discovered that the conditions for harm-producing compliance are not exotic. They don't require ideology, or hatred, or special circumstances. They require a clipboard, a lab coat, and the social pressure to not be the person who ruins the experiment. They are, in other words, available everywhere, in every organization, in every family, in every social context where authority has been distributed unevenly and unanimity is expected. The question his work ultimately poses is not retrospective. It's not, how could those participants have done that? It is forward-looking. It is, what is the architecture of the rooms you are currently in? Who holds the clipboard? Who benefits from your not speaking? And what would it actually cost specifically, to say out loud the thing your conscience already knows? There's a specific thing I'd like you to do before you close this video. Think of a moment, recent, personal, specific, where you deferred to an institutional or social authority and later felt a quiet discomfort you didn't fully examine. Not a dramatic failure of courage, just a moment where the room had a grammar and you followed it. Now ask yourself, what was the lab coat in that situation? A job title? A family role? A majority opinion? A platform's social consensus? Name it, in the comments or just in your own mind, because naming the lab coat is the first step to seeing it next time. And seeing it is not a guarantee you'll break the frame, but it is the precondition. Milgram's participants who were debriefed and told exactly what had happened, they reported that knowing the mechanism didn't make them feel absolved. It made them feel responsible for the first time for the choice they had originally experienced as not a choice at all. That is the uncomfortable gift this research offers. Not guilt, clarity. If this changed how you think about something, subscribe to Night Voyager. We do this every week.